Hello, Hugh Crago.
Hi, Nigel.
Great to see you here. Thank you for joining me for a conversation about the history of PACFA in Australia. It's May 2024, and we'll be talking about the beginning of things in terms of the national organisation of psychotherapy and counselling in Australia. So really great to have you here. I really appreciate you giving your time, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Thanks. So you wanted me to do a very brief.
So Hugh, yeah, I'm really interested in your early, your life story and where you began and how your journey brought you into the sphere of counselling, your early life and your early career, and what led to your interest in counselling.
Okay, well, I graduated from the University of New England in 1968. The year that the Kennedys, yes, right, the year that Bobby Kennedy was shot and Martin Luther King, and about which I took very little notice at the time, I'm ashamed to say, but anyway. And I graduated in English language and literature. So I was training to be a literature academic or a literary critic. I went on and did some further study at Oxford in the UK for another 2.5 years, and got another degree in English. And then I came and started teaching. Theoretically, I was supposed to be teaching literature at what was then Riverina College of Advanced Education, which eventually morphed into Charles Sturt University now, after a long interval. And I was there for 7 years, and I didn't teach much English. I taught a subject called communication, and I was very inspired by the idea of working in groups. I didn't know much about it, but I'd read a lot of radical education material from the UK and the US. I got very excited about it. I discovered those things while I was in England. So I thought I wanted to have a go at doing it. And so we had a somewhat bumpy ride through the next 7 years, in which I kind of was trying to run groups without knowing how to run groups. They weren't therapy groups, but they were supposed to be groups where people interacted and reflected on their interactions. And in fact, I can see, looking back, that was the forerunner of what much, much later in my career I came to Irvin Yalom's group model of group work and practiced it. But that's right at the end of my career. So I was that was my little apprenticeship in working in groups. I realized by the end of it, I realized how much I didn't know and how hopelessly untrained I was for it. So I enrolled in some 1-week-long intensive courses in counselling offered at the time by Ken Miller in Melbourne, and did those, which was a good experience. Wasn't great teaching as I would now define it, because we didn't practice much in the way of skills, but I did get some ideas I got very excited about the idea of counselling. And at the end of the time, I sort of felt played out with the college. I kind of had done as much as I could, plus the college wanted to get rid of me because I was, as to quote their words, practicing psychology without being qualified as a psychologist. I didn't think I was practicing psychology, but that's how the psych people saw it. So I guess that was the start of the theme of Hugh versus the psychs. But anyway, so my wife and I resigned, and we both went off to Antioch, New England Graduate School in New Hampshire in the US, which offered a 2-year full-time master's in counselling psychology, which did not make me a psychologist by Australian standards. It did by American standards. Anyway, that was the best academic training experience I ever had. It was exciting. It was involving it was very inspirational, and there was a lot of practical work involved. We had to see, theoretically, we had to see a lot of clients at an agency placement all the way through the program. So it wasn't like we did theory for a year and then we did practice. Well, it wasn't like that. We did practice all the time, which I think is a very good model and would love to see it more implemented here. And then we came back to Wagga and we couldn't get a job because we weren't psychologists or social workers. There was no place for us in the mental health establishment at that time. So we struggled in private to run a private practice in Wagga for 7 more years. And, you know, again, there was a lot of realizing what I didn't know, but now I was sort of seeing myself as a counsellor, and so was Maureen. And, you know, I was having some successes and a lot of failures in working with people because there was a huge amount that I still didn't understand. And some of the most important things, I would only come to understand them later. In fact, I wouldn't understand them till I started teaching, counselling, that is. So we couldn't make much of a living in Wagga. We then went to Queensland and I was offered a job as the coordinator of a small youth refuge in Southport for disaffected teenagers. And that was a huge learning experience because my counselling skills were totally inadequate to deal with, well, the kids didn't want any counselling anyway for a start. And I didn't have the flexibility or the presence that would have made them feel safe. So I basically worked with their parents, with their families, in the hope of improving things, improving the family relationship, which I had a little bit of success with and a lot of failure. It was hard work. I used to feel exhausted. I felt incompetent most of the time. Oh, I should just pause to talk about family therapy. By then we were involved with the family therapy movement in Australia, which was very open-minded about people's qualifications. And so Maureen and I fitted in there because we weren't psychologists, we weren't social workers, we weren't psychiatrists, the other 3 main groups that were involved in family therapy. But they were all the radical ones. You know, they were the ones who, you know, had a vision of something new and better. And we felt the same way. So we got very involved with that. And we're going to conferences and so on. So I did the homeless youth gig for 2 years and was really glad to be offered a junior lectureship at what was then the Gold Coast College of Griffith University. And there I was offered the chance to teach a 1-semester subject in counselling called Elements of Counselling, which had been written by an American. And again, it wasn't really practical counsellor training, but it was general information about what counselling is and how, you know, how counsellors conduct themselves and what its value was and what the evidence for it was and so on. So I did that for 3 years. At the end of that time, they wanted to get rid of me. This will become a pattern. The management changed and the people who'd appointed me were no longer in charge. Some new broom type people who I would describe as representatives of the new content-free management style, in which you don't have to know anything about the subjects that your staff are teaching. You just manage them, usually in a fairly unskilled way, and strongly attracted, the sort of people who are attracted to the executive jobs in this university culture were, in my opinion, largely highly narcissistic, and it was all about them. They would sweep away whatever was in place and say, well, we'll draw a line under the past, was the term at the time. and let's make something new and better. Let's not talk about what we had before, which I thought was rather sad. Anyway, so so that came to an end after 3 years. They promoted me and then discontinued my job. So then, which is an interesting thing in itself. 2 different bodies within the university were involved, of course. And then I went to University of New England and taught counselling there. Now, that was an actual counsellor training program at postgraduate level, which had been only quite recently set up. There was a lot wrong with it, in my view. And as one of my colleagues there used to say, Hugh, you make these incredible judgments. And I guess I did make a judgment of that course. I thought it should have been a lot better. And I set to work, just about killed myself, to sort of rewrite 6 units, 6 one-semester units, to make them work better and be more meaningful learning experiences for the students, and change the admission process so that we were a lot more selective about the people that we took in. And that, of course, didn't make me any friends at all, either with my colleagues or with the management of the school that I was part of. Hugh's turning away these perfectly good students, and that's another thing. So again, I got promoted to senior lecturer, and then they fired me. I mean, they didn't renew my contract. Happened twice. I'm a big fan of repeating patterns in human lives. You can see why. They really do happen. And of course, it was partly my own doing.
So Hugh, where are we up to in time at the moment?
Sorry,
what
yes,
year do you think?
So now we're talking about 1989.
About 1989 at Jansen Newman. So when you're applying for accreditation.
Oh, sorry, 98. Sorry.
This is already 1998.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. So because it was at the University of New England that I think that you first sort of got concerned about.
Absolutely right.
The organisation.
So
maybe if we come, let's go back to that. So because I was interested in what was, in 1998, what was the accreditation process? Now we have TEXA, the Training and Education Quality Standards Authority. I'm curious about what it was that what it was you were accrediting for Jansen Newman back in 1998. But perhaps because I think it was when you were at the University of New England, that was when you first also started to think, okay, we need to do something more for counselling in Australia. Can you perhaps talk a bit about that, and then maybe we can sort of talk about how your career progressed from there as the profession was also maturing. What was the, because there wasn't a professional association. Well, maybe there were some, but there wasn't a national professional association for counsellors that kind of was able to represent all counsellors in Australia. And that was obviously a weakness for anybody who wanted to call themselves a counsellor. And you and Maureen actually experienced that yourselves after you came back from the US, having done a master's degree in counselling psychology, and being told, well, no, you're not a psychologist, but nor are you really anything else either. You're not a social worker, you're not a psychologist, you're not a psychiatrist. And so you sort of had to find this, this your own way forward, and you're allowed to call yourself a counsellor. And then you've sort of meandered through a career of working with people, initially in Southport with the young people, then exploring family therapy, then lecturing at Griffiths University, where there was elements of counselling, quite literally. And then when you moved to University of New England, you really got stuck in and effectively rewrote an entire program, and also worked hard to make sure that it was a meaningful learning experience that was selective of the kind of people that it brought into that training. And so it was during that time that these concerns, and it sounds like the concerns about the place of counselling in Australia had been percolating for some time, but maybe if we could talk directly around that, what was that percolation, what was that frustration, and what did that then motivate you to try and do?
think it's important here to mention a woman colleague of mine whose name at the time was Dr. Ruth Sturmey. She's now Dr. Ingrid Sturmey, and is still working in Victoria, as far as I know. She was my colleague. She and I were appointed together as 3-year contract staff. And I would say that she deserves a fair bit of the credit for reading the political weather forecast and, sharpening my awareness of how important it was for the counselling profession to start to organise itself, as you were just saying. And that is a kind of maturity, I guess. And I certainly was very supportive of that idea. And we were both aware that there were ominous rumblings from the government that, we were a non-self-regulated profession, and therefore the media would make much out of this and talk about the dangers of people seeing unregulated counsellors who could, and the word at the time that was very common was anyone can hang up their shingle and say they're a counsellor. Quite scornful and dismissive of many, highly skilled people who are working. And of course, there were also people who merited that description, that scornful description, because they knew very little. But their clients didn't have any standards to judge them by. And the other factor that was involved that both Ruth and I were aware of was that the psychology profession in Australia, the APS, was rumoured to be, and I don't know whether this is true or not, but it quite possibly was rumoured to be proposing to the government, hey, there's all these unregulated people out there, let us regulate them. If they won't regulate themselves, we should take them over, and we should take over all the counselling training programs in Australia and make them psych programs. Which we didn't like the sound of and thought was pretty unfair and pretty arrogant, actually. So that was the background to it from that point of view, and Ruth would be the person, or Ingrid as she is now, would be the person to speak to about that in more detail, because that was an important contribution that she made. And then she went on with me to organise this conference, which at the time was, and we're talking 1996, I think, the first standing conference of counsellor and psychotherapy educators and trainers, I think the official title was, but you could check that. So Ruth did a great job of organising it and bringing up people and talking them into coming. And my contribution, I guess, was largely to propose that the conference be a search conference, a participant planned conference, rather than a conference with a formal set agenda from the beginning. That it would not be a conference full of guest speakers, talking heads idea with maybe a little bit of room for discussion. It would actually be something with no talking heads, but only the talking heads would be the people who are actually there talking to each other in small groups. So you can see how my group work orientation, or my kind of excitement about or faith in groups, sort of is playing itself out here. In the preceding 7 years, I had built up some skills in running these kinds of conferences. I ran them for the Arts Council of New South Wales, multiple times, about 15 in also different country locations, and not just in New South Wales, but in other states as well. And they had worked well, so I felt like I had some skills in facilitating that kind of conference. So we invited about 30 people, something like that, I think. Family therapists were probably overrepresented among them simply because they were the people that Maureen and I knew to invite, and they were also very welcoming of the idea. But there were also people representative of quite a range of different psychotherapeutic modalities, from psychodynamic through to all sorts of things. Gestalt, person-centered, and well, there are a lot more, which are the names of which now escape me. But so, not every modality was represented, but we had a good range of representation, and we brought them together in a big room and went through those kind of warm-up exercises, you could call them, which I wrote about in that paper, which probably the one you haven't read, the one called A Process to Facilitate the Building of Temporary Community.
Yep, I have read that one.
You have read that? Oh, okay.
We hosted we hosted a conference in 2022 where we used a very participant-led, collaborative style of a conversational model of conference. That wasn't dominated by talking heads, but was actually about engaging people in conversation. And we're doing another one at the end of June.
Good.
So they're exciting. They're fun and exciting.
Well, it was an exciting event, and it ran for 3 days. So we required people to be there for that long, and various people protested, "Oh, that's too long. I can only get away for 2 days," and this sort of stuff. But we persuaded them to stay for 3 days, and I'm glad we did, because it was a process that unfolded in pretty much according to the theory of group dynamics. And there was a very good feeling at the end of it, so that the conference participants gave their assent to the idea that it was important to, in some way, join together and in some way to self-regulate, that our profession should embrace the idea of self-regulation. We didn't have to tell them they needed to do it. They, to varying degrees, were aware of the same kind of pressures and the same kind of rumors and forecasts that we were. They just hadn't done anything about it as yet. So I think it was really very crucial that we brought people together at that time, and I think it was probably the biggest success of my life as a professional person to do that. But being me, I rapidly got disillusioned with it, and there were 2 more of those conferences, again representatives of the training branch of various modalities or organizations. So it was educators and trainers who were there. But already I thought divisions were then starting to emerge, as group theory would predict, that we sort of got a good feeling going in the, what people always insist on calling the joining phase. And then we went through the storming phase, in which people kind of started to fragment more and become more polarized, and some, people were more and more clearly representing their own sectional interests. So, for example, some people who regarded themselves as psychotherapists weren't that keen on the idea of being in with people who only counselors, which is kind of, I've written about that distinction, which I think is you know, not a good decision, not a good distinction to make, because I think it's a matter of a continuum in which certain things are in common to both counselling and psychotherapy. But at one end of the spectrum, you might have something that's I would really call counselling, and at the other end, I would be certain to call psychotherapy. That there are different things involved, but a lot in common, actually. Anyway, that was just starting to, show itself over the horizon. The second conference.
There's a big middle. There's a big middle. Psychotherapy, counselling. There's the ends.
There's a
big middle of people who cross over and would happily call themselves counsellors who do psychotherapy.
Yes, psychotherapists. A lot of excellent counsellors are doing psychotherapy. They just don't call it that. And I know quite a few psychotherapists who actually do counselling, but don't call it that. So yes, there you go. So after the second conference, I dropped out. I didn't facilitate the second. I stepped back from facilitating after the first one. I thought I've done a good job. I'm not sure that I want to continue to do this. So Ron, I think, and a colleague, Ron Perry, and a colleague facilitated the second one. And there was jockeying for positions in the national organisation that people were then, anticipating we would go on to form. Some people were clearly, interested in the idea of being president, for example, and I could just feel that in the air, and I thought, I don't want a part of this. That's not what we did this for. So probably, typically of me, I sort of pulled out probably too soon.
Maybe if you could crystallize, it wasn't. You said this wasn't what we did this for. What did you do it for? Like what did you see yourself as doing it for, and how did you see it moving away from that initial vision that you had?
I saw that what we had in common as counsellors and psychotherapists was more important than the divisions between different modalities or the rivalries between different training programs. I suppose that's what I'd say. But what I found was that as things progressed, those rivalries and distinctions, came back into focus. And that disappointed me, I think. Yeah.
So you were there at the second one.
I was there at the second one.
And then there was a clear kind of emergence that, yes, we need to put together some kind of singular body to be representative of counselling and psychotherapy.
Yep.
But that hadn't happened after that second year. In the third year, it sounded like you didn't attend in the third year.
No.
So what do you know about what took place and the steps that followed in amongst the jockeying and attempts to differentiate?
I'm not very clear on what happened at the third one because I was no longer on the staff of the university. They had gotten rid of me. I was seen as a dangerous whistleblower and various other things. So,
you were teaching at another counselling training organisation, the Australian College of Applied Psychology.
That was later.
Yeah. And then 2 years, and then that was after UNE, wasn't it?
That was after UNE, yes.
Then 2 years. Then you went to Janssen Newman.
Yes.
And so it would have been around that time that this third, 98, 99, that the third conference was occurring.
That's right.
And then, we see 1999 as the year that PACFA was founded. So we've got this 2024. We're at a 25 year anniversary at the moment. So what are you aware of as unpacking, and what happened to your interest in what was happening?
Good question. I think I was still interested. But wary. And I suppose by then, yes, I was working for the Jansen Newman Institute, one of whose representatives had participated in the first two conferences, David Jansen. I had been very enthusiastic about that process. But I think I just buried myself in trying to make that training program, the J&I training program, work well, and writing the accreditation document and all of that. I just I think I was in a mentally fairly, well, I'll use the words manic and I'll use the word obsessional state at that time, having lost several jobs, and then I lost another one. So so I was getting a bit panicky, and I think my response to that was to work harder and harder at the thing that I was doing, keep my eyes down, give up looking at the big picture, and just sort of try and get the immediate task done and get my satisfaction out of teaching and improving the training programs themselves. But I was getting a bit tired of improving training programs that were already there and thinking, but there must be some that are actually doing it right now, doing it, which I didn't find, although they may well exist. So yeah, I wasn't aware of a whole lot. At the time that Jim Crawley was the first president, so they were in 99 on for the next year or so, I was aware that he did the rounds of quite a lot of state-based organizations and talked to people about PACFA and stuff. But what I noticed thereafter was that the impetus for doing that meeting with grassroots membership kind of thing was falling away. And I think that may be because the initial 3 conferences had envisaged, as you know, an organization of organizations, a peak body kind of thing. And the actual individual organizations like the New South Wales Family Therapy Association, for example, would be the members of PACFA rather than the individual membership model, which PACFA has now gone to, probably correctly, because the other one just didn't seem to. I don't know, there are obviously problems with it, but I'm not really aware of what those problems were. But people seem to be much more happy with the individual membership idea, which is more like what the APS has and the AASW has.
Yeah, I think that the peak body concept was necessary. The peak body concept that was made up of members that were already associations, that they had their own individual members, was necessary. Do you have any sense of, because the initial founding was with the academics, it was the educators.
That's right.
That was where the impetus came from, and then you've created a body that I guess was populated to a great extent by those educators, who are then needing to get the associations on board. And I'm curious about the extent to which, was Australia well populated by associations at that time? Did associations form just so they could be members of this newly formed federation, or a few that did? What can you share what you know about those dynamics?
There were a lot of organizations based on modalities, New South Wales Gestalt, Victorian Gestalt, Queensland, and so for a lot of other modalities, but they were fairly small for the most part. Art therapy, relatively small numbers of people at that time. The psychoanalytic psychotherapy organizations, although, they have a long history and a good name, took in very few students and generated relatively few members because it was a long and arduous 7-year training program, as you probably know. And a lot of people just weren't prepared to pay the money or stick out the time. So I think there were plenty of organizations around, but a lot of them were probably on the small side. And then once PACFA was founded, yes, there were some, there was then a movement to found an association in New South Wales, for example, or Victoria, for counsellors and therapists generally, rather than one based on the modalities that one espoused. And then that could join PACFA and represent those people. That's my memory of what happened back then.
After the formation of the Psychotherapy and Counselling Federation of Australia, which was made up of these numerous member associations, but before that, before that actually happened, anything else that you want to comment on in terms of your experience of the history leading up to it?
Initially, at that first conference, a lot of the movers and shakers were people with a family therapy background, family and couple therapy background, which is not surprising because they were people who, at least one would have thought, that they would have an awareness of a frame of reference larger than just the individual or the one-on-one relationship, that they would see that, people have to relate to other people. And I think several of those people, including Jim Crawley, but there were others, they had very good skills in finding common ground with other people, in speaking in a way that make other people feel safe, even if there were considerable differences there. I think those therapeutic skills were employed in the course of the first conference. Yeah, I think that was important. And I also, as the facilitator, I also tried to keep the momentum of that first conference moving so that there wasn't too much opportunity for people to bog down in strenuous debates about differences, that we would concentrate on the things we had in common rather than the things that divided us. I had that as a conscious aim, and not to mean that you should suppress difference, because I don't believe in that, but believe that's a good idea at all, but to contain that difference or that potential conflict until there was some firm ground established where everybody could feel, yeah, this is right, this is what we should be doing. This is the direction we want to move in. I think there were some egos involved. So many leading therapists. Oh dear. We're not immune from being dominated by our egos, Therapeutic gurus who sort of seek that role, want to be adored, basically, want to be idolized, they want disciples rather than colleagues. I've seen too much of that. And I, of course, have an ego too, but it's not that kind of ego. It doesn't display itself in that kind of way. I just think I'm there to do some good for other people. And if I succeed in doing it, it makes me feel good, obviously. But that's the end of it. It doesn't make me a wizard or I'm going to reform the world in psychotherapy or anything like that. Yeah. And I don't think Carl Rogers was like that. I mean, I don't know enough about Yalom, but I don't think he was particularly like that either. But I do know a lot of others who were like that. It's all ego, it's all narcissism. Even when it was presented as humble, participative, equal, like, oh, we're not, it's so arrogant to say that we know anything more than our clients. No, our clients are our co-therapists and the crap. We're there because we hopefully do know more than they do, but we also know how to facilitate their discovery of what will make things better for them.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. So you saw a lot of ego, and you could see how that played out in the efforts of this disparate group of individuals across, what's essentially one overall profession.
Yeah.
And those egos could easily get in the way and undo the common ground that was being found.
Absolutely.
I've read your article. I agree with its contents.
Do you?
Where I disagree is in our in the sense of optimism that that for the most part the people in our profession agree with what you say.
Okay.
When I read what you say, it has a ring of not self-evidence, but a ring of yes, that's right. Yep, that's what counselling is, and that's what counselling training also should be. While I also, having spent over a decade at ACAP, I'm also very aware of the tensions at play that you describe between the business and the training, the delivery of the training itself. But having been at ACAP for 10 years, 11, 12, and having taught there over that period of time, many hundreds, thousands of students, I'm very aware that what you describe is how I taught. The things that you focus on is the things that I focused on, and that every single class I taught would be broken in half. The first out of 3-hour class, the first half was theory, the second half was practice, and that part of that practice was making sure that I'd actually developed a model of peer supervision where the whole class would break into pairs, and they'd talk about what they needed to work on based on their previous class experience, and then they would get into a group of 4, and they'd all share what it was that they needed to work on, and then they would go and practice, and then they would come back to their pair and debrief how they went, and then they'd get in a group of 4, and then they'd share with a group of 4 how they went. And so that kind of use of both the dyadic and the group processes
and the small group
was very much at play, and it also introduced the nature of supervision and an understanding, an early sense of what it meant to just debrief verbally with someone who was interested in what it was that you had done and how you had done it and what the outcome of that was.
Good.
So yes, very, very much on that page.
Yeah, well, I can see why you would agree with some of the stuff that I wrote. That's great. Yes. I could comment further on that, but we should
hopefully
go on.
we do hold that ground, and we don't give way to the purely academic scientific psychology model. And I think that's to a great extent that's the work of PACFA, to be able to walk that ground, to gain the credibility, but not to feel like we have to do it in the same way that the psychologists have.
That's right. Well, that brings to mind the story of what happened to the Institute of Counselling in Sydney, and with Australian Catholic Hugh. You know about that?
No, please tell the story.
Oh, I don't know whether Ron told you about that, and I don't even know how he sees it, but I would imagine that he's pretty disappointed at what happened. Well, just briefly, the Institute, was one of the more successful, in my view, training programs around. And it did take the learning of skills seriously. And You know, perhaps the theoretical side of it wasn't as tight as it could have been, but you know, its heart was always in the right place, and its heart was always in the relationship, the therapeutic relationship, and training people to do that. And I thought they did a good job, and they did have standards. And the students loved the program, that's not a proof that it was good, but it was good. And then ACU came along and said, you know, look, we're a Catholic university, you're a Catholic organisation. Why don't we auspice your program, you know, in the way that we were all supposed to do at that time, be tied to a big brother university kind of thing, who would, you know, make our program better, more academic, in other words. And the people who were running the institute at the time, because Ron was no longer personally running it, I knew them pretty well. And they said, but what about the unique features of our program? For example, the Yalom style group work and the personal development aspect of the program. And they gave absolute assurance, sharks, nasty people that they are, that all of those aspects would be preserved. It would be run by the psychology department. I mean, this is back to that again. The psych department would run it, but it would run in its own way, as it always had done. Within 3 years, it was gone. They had changed everything. They started with the group work. That's not viable, financially viable. You can't be paying tutors to work with a group of, you know, 9 students or something. That's ridiculous. University can't afford that. Blah, blah, blah. The content should be more evidence-based. It should all be evidence-based. You should be teaching CBT. You should, you know. Yes. And so the staff resigned, the people who wrote it, you know, not surprisingly. Alison and so on, her colleagues, resigned, and the psychologists took it over, and now it is no longer. There isn't a counselling program there.
And that's a good allegory, isn't it, for the entire professions of psychotherapy and counselling, and the risk of the reality that it's not valued, like the things that counsellors and psychotherapists value about the work they do isn't valued by the paradigm of psychology, and that the core tenets of a scientific psychology and a humanistic art of psychotherapy and being with people, they're very difficult to reconcile. And people like Carl Rogers and Irvin Yalom, you know, were two of the rare prominent people who were able to straddle and reconcile those differences, predominantly by leaving their scientific roots behind and moving into deeply philosophical, humanistic territory in the case of Carl Rogers, and existential territory in the case of Irvin Yalom. Each of them bringing, you know, their psychology training with them, and in Yalom's case, bringing his very psychodynamically informed psychiatric work with him as well. But very much, you know, as Yalom is often quoted as saying, it's the relationship that heals. It's the relationship that heals. It's the relationship that heals.
Yeah,
and that really is what makes counselling special. But it's not sexy. It's not sexy to governments that are driven by economics, and economics speaks the same language as science, the language of statistics, and it's that language that a relational humanistic style of being with people that's very, very powerful and evocative, and is clear at a lived experience level, and is supported by the factors, by the research, including the common factors research, and any of the cross modality studies that are ever done, always showing that actually the technique doesn't matter. It's actually the individuality of the therapist
That's right.
that seems to make the difference.
That's right.
But that's the risk. And so the risk that you saw and Ruth saw back in the 90s, that psychology, if it could, would do away with psychotherapy and counselling, or completely encompass it and make it its own. That's still very present today. The counselling, the College of Counselling Psychology at the Australian Psychological Society, their conference this year is on psychotherapy. And when you look at the format, when you look at the schedule, when you look at what's being presented, the counsellors and psychotherapists would say, no, that's not psychotherapy. That's just CBT, and would be hard pressed to include CBT as a psychotherapy.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I wouldn't include it. I would say it's counselling technique, and not a very good one. And it is not evidence-based. I'm sorry, but the founder of CBT, the mantra was back then, I assume they've dropped it now, I would hope they've dropped it now, but for many years it was your thoughts come first, and then your thoughts trigger your feelings. Now it is actually, as you know, completely the other way around. The right hemisphere fires first, then the information goes to the left, then it comes back to the right, all in microseconds, but nevertheless, it is the right hemisphere that's neuronally connected with all the, that's where the emotions come from.
Perception, I would say perception, emotion, interpretation.
Yes. Perception, emotion, interpretation, that's right. And the left hemisphere gets to say at that point. But so that's actually the left, and it's exactly what McGilchrist says about how the left hemisphere has usurped the role of master. Because that scientific model of how to do therapy based on evidence actually fails to grasp the most significant things about therapy and why it works. It can't even see that it is working and that it is significant. So I think there's a lot. I've spent most of the last 10 years, trying to understand McGilchrist and, slowly working my way through his new 2-volume book, which is huge and, quite demanding. But because he writes so well, it is possible to read it. And it's just, this has been the most formative influence on my thinking for the last, in the last 20 years, I think. Just even though it's not actually about therapy or anything, but he was a psychiatrist, and that's so true. And now, anyway, I won't go on about that, but yeah. I think I was
enjoying it,
and I try and introduce students to the basics of that approach. Let's understand the nature of how the left side is different from the right side, which is what McGilchrist is really on about. That it's not that the right is emotional and the left is irrational, or the right, all of those ones. It's a lot more complicated than that. But basically, the right hemisphere is in touch with reality, and the left potentially is not, because it doesn't have any direct connection to the real world. It has to deal only with what the right hemisphere presents to it neuronally. Anyway, enough.
And what part of what we're talking about is a really interesting point at which science really crossed the domains of the psychological approach to mental health and the therapeutic approach, and that was neuroscience, because I certainly remember, and actually it would have been around the same time as you were having these search conferences that neuroscience appeared on the scene. That until we had accurate imaging, we only had ideas around what was happening in the brain, and that's where those ideas from as you described from cognitive therapy, came from around first there's a thought and then there's a feeling. And then neuroscience had gave an opportunity to test some of that.
Yeah.
And I remember as a counselor and psychotherapist being really excited by the possibilities of neuroscience and being okay, now we can actually begin to see what's actually going on, rather than relying upon models to describe what's going on, and then having what I would say is fairly flawed science around trying to prove, which model was the best model to that point.
Yeah. Yep.
All right. So interesting. So if we come back then to the professions, I think we've started sort of touching on it there. One of my questions was around key people and key achievements. I'm not sure if you've got anything more to say about key people and key achievements, particularly in the early days.
The early years. Probably not, Nigel.
Yeah.
Probably not. No.
Yeah. The next question is what have you seen over time as the challenges for the profession, and specifically the professional body, and the lost opportunities?
The lost opportunity, or one lost opportunity, is, as you would know from reading that most recent paper, is that we've lost the opportunity to establish an image in the minds of, well, people, like the general public, other professionals, an image of what we do stand for that is different from what they stand for. I think that's a lost opportunity.
People don't know, and both prospective students and also prospective members of the public actually seem to think that psychology is counselling.
Yeah, because that is what psychology has always told us it is. We are the ones who know how to do counselling. Don't trust any of these other shonks, crystal gazers and things. We know the real deal, the scientific, way of doing it, and it's evidence-based.
And I'll often talk to someone and ask, have you seen a counsellor? And they'll say yes, and I say, were they a psychologist? yes, of course. Of course, my counsellor was a psychologist. What else would my counsellor be?
Right. Well, that's how the APS wants everybody to think, and they've done a remarkably good job, I think, of taking the high ground. And I haven't seen our profession, as represented by PACFA, really step up and sort of say, actually, no, we do this. This is what we do. It's quite different from what you do. What you do is very valid within its own frame of reference. Cognitive science, that's why I coined the term relational art, because I thought we need something to go against. They say they're a cognitive science. Yes, that's a fair description. They are a cognitive science. We are a relational art.
And that's the opportunity. That's the lost opportunity there that we haven't been able to sell that idea of the value of relational art, and that's what counselling and psychotherapy is, and that's what counsellors and psychotherapists do. And actually, I think there's also been a lack of confidence in the face of the wide broadcasting of the incredible value of psychological sciences, that we haven't sold the fact that actually most people, not all of them, but most people, many people actually want to engage with a relational art. They don't actually want to engage with a cognitive science, and they don't know that they've got a choice.
No, that's not. Well, that would be a good way of putting it. I really think that's why I eventually came towards the end of that article, and I don't know whether it's on the version that you read, where I borrowed from Aldi. Good, different. Says it very well. I'd like us to be saying good, different.
Good, different. Yeah. You mentioned last time perhaps a lost opportunity around communication with members.
Yes, I could elaborate on that. Yes, I don't want to name names, but the people who occupied the CEO role earlier on, well, really right up to Johanna, I'd have to say. She's the first one I've seen that seems to me to be smart enough, and although she's not a therapist or a counsellor herself, aware enough of what the keys to it are to make, to get us somewhere. I think previous ones have been, in the counsellor model to the extent that they were very careful what they said, not very prepared to take risks, not wanting to make any public statements, or just rah-rah public statements of the kind that so many CEOs make in every kind of organization. Like rather than being honest and saying, we don't do this, we do this, like, yes, these are real differences. Yes, psychologists have something to offer, but we have something different, etc. Not prepared to go there at all. And also, I think under those same CEOs, the organizational, I don't know a lot about it, but I used to find the website unsympathetic to deal with. It may not be now. I haven't tried it for a few years, but I'll start in a different place. The whole impression of the organization was cold, interpersonally cold, kind of pulled back, businesslike. The fact that when you pay for your membership fee, you are, they've used a software package designed for commerce. And so you have to put your membership, whatever, in the cart, and you have to buy it. And, like that seems so utterly different from the spirit of relational art to me. And I thought, why couldn't somebody have just spotted this and had it redesigned a bit, or, tinkered with a bit so that it didn't look like that? That was one example. People that I spoke to, this is going back probably 15 years or so it's not really relevant necessarily to the present, but it was just the admin people that I spoke to were mostly unsympathetic, businesslike, cool, didn't seem to know what I was talking about sometimes, and I just gave up. I just thought, I hate this. That's why I eventually withdrew, and only signed up again under duress, because otherwise I couldn't have worked with a particular client that I now have, who required me to do the SIRA training in New South Wales for working with workers' comp people. So I duly did it, and then I spoke to Johanna about it because the training was so awful, in the sense that, it's awful training anyway, but entirely content-based, but it didn't recognize the place for us, like the interventions were all psychology. And in order to get through the exams at the end of every unit, I had to pretend to be a psychologist. And I'm still doing it for this client. I have to fill out, this form every 8 sessions and specify behavioral goals that my client is aiming for, and it's very difficult because I've never worked that way. And she certainly, my client certainly doesn't work that way. She's got a goal down there that we agreed on some time ago. She was going to do a pottery course, enroll for a pottery course, which would have been a good idea, but she hasn't done it. So now I've got to find a way of representing to them that she is working on, she is actually making progress, even though she has not done the pottery course, because on the face of it, scientifically, she should be going backwards because she hasn't done the pottery course. You know what I mean? That's
absolutely
really frustrating.
what I hear you talking about is a kind of professional inauthenticity or a professional incongruence that we as counsellors and psychotherapists are faced with if we work in existing systems like mental health systems, workers' compensation schemes, other sorts of institutionalized facilities. Very often the systems are devised by psychologists with a very, very heavy emphasis on assessment and then behavioral interventions and behavioral outcomes. Then it takes a significant kind of mental effort to try and rework our clients to fit into those structures.
Definitely.
And it's interesting. I left the law because my experience of being a solicitor was that my job was to take the fullness of a person and to carve off all the rough edges so that they could fit into the requirements of the legal system, because my job was to get them the best outcome that I could, to act in their best interests. But it was very uncomfortable because I didn't like doing that. And as counsellors and psychotherapists, we like to work with the whole person, and we like to work towards making people whole. And often what we're asked to do by these very psychologically informed systems is to not do that, to make derivatives of the person to fit in systemic ideas.
That's right.
And structures.
Right. Exactly. Absolutely. Which again, McGilchrist would see that as a left hemisphere dominated process, stemming from the priorities of a left hemisphere dominated profession, which psychology most certainly is.
As informed by science, because the requirement of psychology is that it must stay, in order for its success, it has absolutely had to stay within the confines of what is scientific, and in particular what the medical profession defines as medical science. And so long as psychology, the profession of psychology, stays within that, it maintains its credibility. And almost by definition, psychotherapy and counselling take the space of everything that sits outside of that rigid scientific definition.
Yes. Well, not quite everything, but a lot.
Not everything, a lot of. Yes. And the other topic that you touched on was the accreditation of training programs as possibly a challenge and lost opportunity. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, my experience of it was that, and this was at was it at Janssen Newman? I don't know. No, I don't think it was. I think I'd been gone before they did that. But at Western Sydney University, which I ended up, I should just say this for the record, because I look like such a parade of failures in my earlier career. But I did full 8 years at Western Sydney Uni, and I got promoted there. And by and large, it was a good experience, and I had supportive bosses who, for the most part, not all of them, understood what we were about and were supportive of what we were trying to do. So that was good. But as soon as I left, it's reverted to take all. They don't take all the students who apply, but they're taking now quite a lot of students that I would think are unsuited, on the grounds that they'll get valuable personal development out of it, and maybe they'll learn to be counsellors. But my view of that is very pessimistic. They probably won't learn to be counsellors. But anyway.
So what then is your comment on accreditation and the role of the professional association in relation to effective accreditation of training programs for counsellors?
Well, they should have more stringent standards than they have. I saw them, at least, back 10, 15 years, I saw them acting like counsellors towards, like in the broad sense of the word, towards training programs. Oh, look, we'll accept what you're doing. It's, your intentions are really good. There's a few things you might need to tweak, but, like basically it's unconditional positive regard. And I didn't think that unconditional positive regard was the appropriate attitude to take towards a training program designed to produce counsellors who would be well-informed, skilled and ethical.
So what did you believe would be the appropriate stance?
Well, I thought they should have asked more searching questions. They should have I remember that one aspect of the accreditation was that, there was a student who was called on to talk about their experience of the program or whatever, which is fine. But of course, the academics in charge of the program selected a student who had an extremely positive experience of the program and, and was articulate enough to be able to say that in a very convincing way. They read the course outlines, but they didn't actually look at what was happening in the classes or what was said in the classes. Nobody sat in on a single skills training session to see whether that was any good or not. Now, I know those things are expensive to mount and that people, the people on the panels were often doing it without pay and that sort of stuff. But I just thought it was too loose and really. I think I can remember they gave us a list of a couple of things that we were supposed to have improved by the time they came back in 5 years' time or whatever, but it was not nearly as comprehensive as the list I would have produced about our program from the inside. And, I know it's a problem because I do have high standards and I just think we should, because again, psychology and social work do not vet their students at all on the basis of personal suitability for the profession. They only vet them on the basis of academic competence. So even I know of only one clinical psych program in Australia, and this is going back 12 years or something. It may no longer be true. I hope it isn't. There was just one program, which was Macquarie Uni, where they stringently selected people for the Clin Psych Masters on the basis of personal qualities as well as the fact that they got, seconds one or whatever in their final year of training. So it wasn't just academic, it was also personal. All the rest, if you were bright enough, you get in. My sister was friends with some of them at University of Queensland, prestige university, prestige degree, and when his friend would come to her and say, I haven't got a clue what to do with this client, I'm so frustrated with this client. Well, we can all say that, but, she didn't know how to deal with it. No personal work, no personal reflection, no journaling, nothing. And then those people go out and say what was reported by a current client of mine. She's married. Their relationship is one of the issues. He went off to see a counsellor of his own and by his own account, said to the psychologist, oh, look, I'm really worried about my marriage. I'm wondering what on earth is wrong with me. Psychologist's response, let's guess. Come on, mate, you're being first session. Too hard on yourself. Maybe the question you're asking the wrong question. It's not what's wrong with you. It's have you married the wrong woman? Very reassuring, I'm sure. But what an egregiously uncalled for judgment to make when you barely know the client.
Totally unscientific.
Utterly unscientific, because this is a person who'd never been trained to look at, any of those dynamics. Anyway, so I think we ought to be doing that, all of that personal work, that sort of quasi-therapeutic work with our clients as much as we can. We should just write it in as a requirement of the course at the beginning.
Students.
And then if the students don't want to do that, they can go do psych or something, But instead, the universities take them all in, and then there's some personal development in the course. There's quite a lot in the UWS course, WSU, sorry, and then a small number of them complain to the powers that be and say we're being forced to do these highly invasive exercises, which it's traumatizing me, and it's unethical. And so for several years, our group program at Western Sydney was shut down because of those complaints. 3 students complained out of 40, and whole group programs, all the here and now groups, all the Yaloms type work was. I was hurt. It's wrong. They need to sign up. They need to know what they're signing up for, and sign up for it, and sign a disclaimer or something that says, I agree, I know that my feelings may be hurt, or I may experience a whole range of feelings, and it may send me into some level of personal turmoil for a time, because that is a common experience of students in this program. But I am prepared to undertake this and to trust that the program will deal with these things and offer me appropriate support if this happens. Some wording like that, that's what we should have.
An understanding, a clear understanding that the journey, it's a journey, and the journey into becoming a professional is exactly that, and that journey will often not necessarily require, but it will often include within it painful experiences and very, very challenging experiences about the self. And when you told me that story about that individual student, who the one who sort of couldn't handle the frustration, we have those interpersonal experiences, and they can be created in the safety of a training environment.
Sure.
So that as professionals, we learn to manage those feelings for ourselves and be able to, even better than manage them, we learn to be able to use them with therapeutic intent,
use them therapeutically,
rather than what is likely to happen without that formative experience is that a therapist will have feelings and displace them in all sorts of different directions without knowing how to use them.
That's right. Absolutely. No, you understand.
And I would agree that that's completely missing from psychology as well. Yeah. That understanding that actually the emotional experience of the therapist has a significant part to play in how the therapy unfolds. There's all the ideas of bias and transference and countertransference all come into play. Any other observations on the successes and failures of the professions and the professional associations more broadly? I think you've touched upon the role of the professional association in making public statements. Feel free to say some more about that. And then when we spoke earlier, you were, I think, quite critical of the academic writing requirements.
Yes. Well. Yes. I think, and this is another left hemisphere dominated thing, is that academics generally tend to fall into the trap of thinking that if they deploy complex abstract language when they're explaining some concept, then that makes their work more academically credible, or that it rises, it enhances their status, or it shows that they know more than lay people do because they can use these words. And quite often in professional journals, so we used to get it in the Family Therapy Journal, but I've also seen it in PACJA, with articles written by some quite prominent people in the field in Australia, that, it's unnecessarily complex and abstract when they could make their point much more plainly and simply in a way that a broader range of people could read and understand. Because I thought the spirit of our profession was that counsellors and therapists speak to people in a language that they can understand.
So both the teaching and the use of plain language.
Plain, clear English.
To communicate ideas.
That's right. Unfortunately, the teaching of plain, clear English is no longer done in schools. And what I found in academe was that in the old days, academics, no matter what their discipline was, they would correct your spelling and your punctuation, and that's less important, but they would correct errors of usage, and they, strike out the word that was the wrong word, and you mean this, et cetera, et cetera. And now nobody does. And so it's left to the subject specialist in that discipline to correct things. Even the English, even the English language and literature, people don't correct their spelling anymore. I'm sorry, I shouldn't keep saying spelling because that's the least important of all of those things. But I was raised in the era when you were supposed to learn to spell, and that was supposed to be a great thing.
And you were formed through a series of serious English language literature trainings, both in Australia and in Oxford.
Yes, I was, but the key texts of that time were books that emphasised that highly educated people should always write in language that a reasonably intelligent lay person could understand, even if they knew nothing about your discipline, which I thought was a great model, but it's been completely lost.
Language needs to be accessible.
Accessible, that's right.
So perhaps my next question is around your vision for the future of the professions, and it sounds like we've touched on some of that already, because your key points that you mentioned to me earlier were around really making a point of promoting how counselling is different to psychology, rather than trying to be a part of or a subset of psychology.
Exactly.
And that then leads to highlighting the relational dimensions, the forming, maintaining, and managing of ruptures in a therapeutic relationship as being really core to both the training journey, the personal development journey, and then the practice of counselling.
Yep, I agree. I think couldn't say it better. And the one other thing I suppose that I would say before we finish is more person-to-person contact from yourself and Johanna or other people at the top of PACFA on a meet and greet, talk with people, ask about their problems that they experience, because I mean, everybody's gone overboard for online communication as being the way to do it, and I know it is a good resource, and I do use it a bit myself, but my strong preference has always been for when there's something important to be discussed, face to face is better. And I still think that, and I think that personal contact, it's like this is a wild analogy, but generations of Labor prime ministers, who were all fervent Republicans, get to meet the Queen, right? In the days when it was the Queen, and they get won over in the sense that they become less fervently Republican. They might still feel that a republic would be a good thing, but because they had a personal contact with somebody that was just in this, never land of, immediate, and negative associations with those people, because, they're filthy rich and they don't do anything, and, they're just blah, 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 and England doesn't own Australia, et cetera, et cetera. But what they experienced, Bill Hayden said, well, he said, I found the Queen a consoling presence. Right? I think when I talked to Johanna for the first time, I thought, oh my God, this is finally somebody I can talk to, who understands what I'm saying and isn't going to sort of tidy me away with some platitude.
Consoling presence.
A consoling presence, but also an intelligent, smart, resourceful, consoling presence.
And what I hear you saying is that presence, that the physical presence,
yes,
of myself as president of PACFA, as Johanna as the CEO, is consoling and encouraging and inviting and connecting for a broader base of members.
And it encourages people to be more honest about their difficulties, because I went to one presentation by a former CEO at a big conference. It might have been the PACFA conference. You know, it was rah, 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 and we're doing this and we're doing that, and it's great, and all the language of light and bright, you know, that those people go on with. And I thought, I feel no trust in this person whatsoever. If she had acknowledged some of the real difficulties that we all know are there, then I would have been far more inclined to trust her. And I think since we're about relationship, the place to show it is, you know, in the way that the hierarchy of PACFA interact with its membership.
Mm.
If you feel connected, right brain to right brain communication, right?
Yeah, person to person.
You know, I felt he understood. Like you've given, you know, you've given really good responses to things that I've said when you've summarized them. So I know you have actually heard and understand what I'm talking about. You haven't tried to tidy me away, even if you might privately disagree with some of the more outrageous things I've said. You know, that all of that counts. See, you've got a lot of credibility now. Johanna has a lot of credibility with me, and I wouldn't be the only one.
I think that's probably a lovely place to leave it, Hugh. Lovely. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for sharing your experience with me, and for the people who into the future will be listening in and observing what it is that we've captured here today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for asking me. Thanks, Nigel.